Have you ever heard that saying, it's not you, it's me? Well, what if that played out in a marriage? But instead of just, a breakup, it turns into this whole legal battle about whether someone's past makes them incapable of, actually keeping their marriage vows. That's what we're diving deep into today. A Supreme Court case that flips that idea on its head.
Yeah, it really forces us to think about some tough questions, like what does it really mean when someone says, I don't, but they really mean I can't? And then how do you even begin to prove that in court?
So true. Okay, so let's break this down. We're talking about the case of Jerik Estella versus Nina Perez. It's GR no, 249250, and the decision came out on September 29, 2021. On the surface, it seems like a pretty normal love story. They met at work, fell in love, and even with a few bumps in the road early on, like an unplanned pregnancy and even questions about paternity, they still decided to get married.
Right. But it's what happens after the I do's that turns this case from ordinary to pretty extraordinary. Jerik's testimony paints a picture of a marriage that fell apart pretty quickly.
And not just your typical we grew apart kind of thing. Jerik described his wife as being kind of indifferent to their son. He even said she slept through his fevers and seizures. And on top of that, he claimed that she always chose her friends over family time, constantly started fights, and would just leave the house after arguments.
Right. And, some people might hear that and think, well, that's just a troubled marriage, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that someone's psychologically incapacitated, but that's exactly what this case tries to figure out. Where do we draw the line?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Because ultimately, Jerik filed for annulment. He cited Article 36 of the Philippine Family Code, the one about psychological incapacity. And from there, things get kind of interesting.
Yeah, so the Regional Trial Court, or RTC, actually sided with Jerik at first. They granted the annulment, basing it mostly on his testimony and the expert opinion of a clinical psychologist. The psychologist diagnosed Nina with borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder.
Well, wait, two personality disorder. That sounds pretty serious.
It does, and that's why the Office of the Solicitor General, the OSG, they appealed the decision. They argued that just because someone has a diagnosis, it shouldn't automatically mean they can't fulfill their marriage vows. And the Court of Appeals, they actually agreed. They overturned the annulment, and that sent the case up to the Supreme Court.
Wow, what a ride.
Yeah.
So what happened at the Supreme Court? Did they side with Jerik, or did they agree with the OSG and the Court of Appeals?
Well, they did something even bigger. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Jerik and reinstated the annulment. But UT, and this is a big but, they used this case to clarify what psychological incapacity really means in Philippine law.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about having a diagnosis, right?
Exactly. The Supreme Court shifted away from needing a strict medical diagnosis. They focused instead on something they called personality structure. It's basically about looking at how someone's whole personality affects their ability to meet the obligations that come with being married.
Got it. So it's less about having a label and more about how someone's personality actually impacts their ability to, function in a marriage.
You got it. And that's where things get really interesting, because then the court had to figure out what incurable means in this context, right?
Yeah.
It's not like someone can take a pill and suddenly become a good spouse.
So how do they define it?
They said that incurable, at least legally speaking, means that the incapacity is something that lasts. It's persistent, especially in relation to the specific spouse. It's about showing that this inability to fulfill marital duties was there from the beginning of the marriage and made it impossible, not just difficult.
Okay, I see. So let's bring it back to Jerik and Nina. What's the proof that Nina's personality made it impossible for her to be a good wife to him?
Well, that's where the details of what Jerik said become really important. Remember, it wasn't enough for him to just say, my wife's got problems. He had to give specific examples of her behavior and convince the court that these actions weren't just, bad choices or quirks. He had to prove that they showed she couldn't function within their marriage.
So it's like connecting the dots, right? You take all these incidents and show how they create a pattern that points to this underlying incapacity.
Yeah, exactly. And the court pointed to some specific examples from what Jerik said about Nina's behavior to illustrate this. Remember how he talked about her seemingly not caring about their son? He talked about times when she would sleep through his fever, even seizures. Now imagine yourself as a parent, as a spouse. Wouldn't you be super worried? Rushing to your child's side.
Totally. I mean, that's just natural, right?
Right. And according to Jerik, this lack of concern from Nina, it was a pattern. He also talked about how she would rather spend time with her friends than with him and their son. Again, it's not just about one or two times. It's about a consistent pattern of behavior that suggests that she couldn't really connect with or prioritize her own family.
Okay, so I see how the court started to piece this together. But didn't Jerik also say that she started fights a lot and would leave the house after they argued? I mean, a lot of couples argue, right?
Oh, of course. Conflict's normal in any relationship. But it's how those fights went down that the court found important. Jerik said that Nina seemed to pick fights all the time and then would just leave the house, sometimes for a long time, leaving him to care for their son alone.
Oh, wow. So it's not about the arguing itself, but about not being able to, like, work through those conflicts in a healthy way.
Mhm.
And the fact that she didn't seem to care how her actions affected her husband and child.
Exactly. The court saw this pattern, along with her seeming detachment from her son and her choosing friends over family. All together, they said this painted a picture of someone who just fundamentally couldn't engage in the give and take, the mutual support and respect that you need for a healthy marriage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Huh.
But let's try and see it from another angle for a second. Couldn't someone say that maybe Nina was just unhappy in the marriage? You know, maybe she was going through some tough stuff personally that made it hard for her to be a good wife and mom at that time.
That's a good point. And the court thought about that too. But remember, the key here is showing that the incapacity came from how she was wired mentally, not just from a phase or a reaction to things happening around her. That's why the actual evidence matters so much, the specific patterns and how she acted.
Okay, so they weren't saying Nina was a bad person or that she could never have good relationships. They were focused on whether she could handle the specific things that come with being married to Jerik.
Exactly. It's a really important difference. The court said that what makes someone psychologically incapacitated in one marriage might not be a problem in another context is everything.
It seems like the court was trying to balance things carefully. They wanted to make sure marriage is taken seriously,
Yeah.
but also recognize that sometimes annulment is the only fair option.
Right. It's a tough balance. And they really stress that psychological incapacity shouldn't be used lightly. Courts have to be careful and not make it a quick fix for any marriage that has problems.
So it's not about letting people just walk away from their promises. It's about understanding that sometimes those promises were made when things were already impossible because of things the person can't control.
Exactly. It's acknowledging that sometimes people, because of how their personality is, just can't keep those essential promises of marriage, no matter how much they want to.
And the cases we've talked about, Jerik and Nina's and the Tanandel case, they offer some good guidance for dealing with this complicated area of law.
Yeah, they remind us that you can't just look at a checklist. You have to look at each case closely, considering all the evidence and what was going on in that specific relationship.
And we saw how expert opinions can help in that process. They bring out those details and help us understand how someone's personality can impact their ability to be in a marriage.
Definitely. Even though the court doesn't require a formal medical diagnosis anymore, they get the expert analysis can be really helpful to connect the dots between what you see someone doing and the psychological stuff behind it.
So it's a more well-rounded approach.
Yeah.
Looking at the whole person, their past, how they usually act, and how all that affects whether they can do the things married people are supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing we're learning here. The law changes over time. It adapts to how complicated relationships are and what we understand about how people's minds work.
In this case, Jerik Estella versus Niña Perez is a big example of that change.
Yeah.
It made us rethink what marriage really means, the role of mental health in court, and how to be fair in the world of families, which is so personal and delicate.
It's a case that I think will keep influencing the law for a long time. It's given us a lot to consider.
It has, for sure. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What do you think about this case and what it means for the future? Do you think it's clearer now where the line is between just not getting along and being psychologically incapacitated? Or is it even more blurry now? What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Yeah, it really makes you think. And like we've been saying, this decision goes way beyond just Jerik and Nina's story.
Oh, for sure. This case has really opened up this whole new way of looking at Article 36 of the Family Code, you know? It's definitely gotten people talking, even legal experts, about where that line really is between a marriage that's just rocky and one that's broken because of psychological incapacity.
Because honestly, that line can be tough to see, right?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that people aren't using this idea the wrong way? You know, like as an easy excuse to get out of any marriage that's having trouble.
That's a real worry, and the Supreme Court knew that. They actually talked about it in their decision. They said that psychological incapacity shouldn't be a throwaway term, and courts need to be careful not to use it to solve any marital problem that comes up.
So it's not about giving people an out, right? It's about seeing that sometimes people made these promises when things were already impossible, and it's not their fault.
Right. Right. It's about recognizing that because of how they are, some people truly can't keep the basic promises of marriage, even if they want to.
And these cases we've talked about, Jerik and Nina's and the Tanandel case, they give us some really helpful ways to think about this whole thing.
Yeah, they show us that it's more than just checking boxes off a list. We have to really look at each case, all the evidence, and what was happening in that relationship.
And we saw how important expert opinions can be, right? They help us see those little details and understand how someone's personality can actually affect whether they can be married or not.
Totally. Even though they don't need a doctor's diagnosis anymore, the court gets that experts can help us see the connection between what someone does and why they do it, the psychology behind it.
So it's like a bigger picture approach. You look at the whole person, their past, how they act, and how that all adds up to whether they can handle being married.
Exactly. And I think that's something important we're seeing here. The law changes, you know?
Yeah.
It keeps up with how complicated relationships are and what we're learning about how people's minds work.
And the case of Jerik Estella versus Nina Perez, it's a big example of that change. It really made us rethink what marriage is all about, how mental health fits into court cases, and how to be fair in family matters, which can be so personal and touchy.
It's a case that I think will keep having an impact on the law for a long time. It's definitely given us a lot to think about.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive today, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on this case and what it all means? Do you think we have a clearer idea now of what's just the rough patch in a marriage and what's psychological incapacity? Or is it even harder to tell now? Tell us what you think in the comments below.
And if you enjoyed this dive into this really important case, make sure you subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world of law and all the cases that shape how we live. Thanks for listening. Actually